general, how are children in British Columbia doing? Because you've been doing these measurements for 10 years. How are we doing in relation to, I don't know, what do we relate to? The rest of Canada, the rest of the world? Because EDI is done in a lot of places, right?
Yeah, well, we have EDI data now in 15 countries. 80% of Canada has been covered by population, nearly 100% of Australia. The comparisons I can make the best are in Canada. And basically, we're doing moderately poorly within the Canadian frame. So the vulnerability rates here are among the highest in the country. And they've been getting slightly worse as time's been going on over the last 10 years, is what we've seen. Not so much for the language and cognitive scales, but more for the physical, social, emotional scales.
Why?
Excellent question. Do I know the answer exactly? Generally speaking, it seems as though that what's been happening is that the socioeconomic pressures on families are trumping the things that are happening closer to home. That is to say, and this is true across the country, but it's very much true in BC, in Vancouver, where housing prices are what they are, that the amount of time and energy that families have to put into the labor market to maintain a given socioeconomic level has been going up, right? So time poverty is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. Between 1996 and 2006, you know, the average family had to put 300 hours per year more into the labor market to maintain a given socioeconomic level than they did 10 years earlier. And it seems that one way or another, those things are trumping the, you know, shall we say, the modest investment kind of things that we've been doing up until now, such as full-day kindergarten or say Strong Start programs, which isn't to say that those programs aren't effective, but that there's something very large that's happening to family life in our province, and so far we haven't mounted the resources to counter that.
It's interesting because what you're saying is that it's not just the poverty itself that is causing these kinds of problems, because there are countries where there's poverty,
yes,
but you don't have the same kind of that have worse poverty than British Columbia, that's for sure.
Yes.
But their children don't have the same kinds of low scores on the EDI. They're not as vulnerable. So you said time poverty, which was a very interesting term. But yeah, can you tell us about countries that have a lot worse problems with poverty, but children are doing better?
Well, what I can say is this. First off, that everybody should understand that when you look at, let's say, children according to neighborhoods on that map that I showed before, if we were to put in there information about the socioeconomic characteristics of the neighborhoods, what you would see is that the vulnerability rates go up gradually as you go from the most privileged neighborhoods to the least privileged neighborhoods. It's not that there are poor kids and they're doing really bad and everybody else is doing equally well. That's not the way it works at all. At the lowest end, either in some of the most privileged neighborhoods or some of the most cohesive areas in the province, such as Revelstoke, for instance, less than 10% of the kids are vulnerable. And then across the broad middle class, you know, 18 to 30% of the kids are vulnerable, and then you start going down and then you start seeing higher vulnerability rates. So it's a gradient, as we say, which means that although children in the poorest communities are most likely to be vulnerable, numerically, most of the vulnerable kids are spread across the middle class at a rate of about 25%, right? So that's the rule that we can see. If you start digging into communities which are less privileged, let's say you go to some place like Chile, right? What you will tend to see is that on things like the language and cognitive scales, the kids may score lower, but they do not score lower on the social and emotional scales, right? That, and indeed, you know, for instance, in British Columbia, you know, when you start digging into Aboriginal communities, that's the same sort of thing that you see. That there is a little bit in our modern society of trading off social and emotional against language and cognitive. Right? And I'm afraid sometimes that, you know, when people like me tell the brain wiring stories, as I did earlier on, that what people think is little Einsteinism, right? You know, I've got to, you know, I've got to get those abstract circuits going, and without thinking about the fact that the social and emotional development and the language and cognitive development are best when they grow together.
So that gets at the heart of what we call heart-mind learning. It's about the balancing
Yes.
the two somehow.
That's right.
And you're saying countries like Chile, is that what you said? That
Yeah.
they have a better way to balance that somehow?
Well, I don't want to exaggerate what they do. I mean, when you go to Chile and you find out what fraction of children before school age have been exposed to picture books, it's really sad. And for that matter, you're dealing with a culture too where the issues of violence against children haven't been, aired in the same way. But in terms of connectedness, it's very different there, and you do see that kind of thing does come through, and we need more of that kind of information.
So that's the kind of information that I'm going to be picking at the pearls of your brain. Is that what I'm doing? I'm not very good at those sayings that I'm going to be asking you about what do we know? What are the differences that make a difference? And so for the next little while, let's just talk about that. And one of the things is you've talked about at the family level, the idea of having an opportunity just to connect to the child, just to be able to look at the child in the face.
Yes.
So is there a way to look at what differences make a difference, starting with at the family level and then moving out to the community level?
Yes, there is. So at the family level, in a certain way, a lot of it is simply codifying common sense, right? So for instance, there are some very simple tools that have been used in the past to look at the way in which parents relate to their children. When we had the National Longitudinal Study of Children and Youth in Canada, they had an 11-point questionnaire that dealt with basically a series of ways in which you handled your young child. And out of that, you could identify parents who were disengaged, parents who were authoritarian, or parents who were inconsistent. That is to say, they would have a tendency to pick a good kid and a bad kid, or that their treatment of their kids would be very dependent on, what workday had been like, so that they would be unpredictable. So about 30% of Canadian parents fell into the authoritarian, disengaged, or inconsistent, right? And the other 70% fell into the category of authoritative, but not authoritarian and engaged, right? So basically,
what does that mean?
Well, it's basically about good enough parenting. It's about the idea that you are connected with your kids, you know where they're at, you have rules, but you enforce them flexibly, that you have enough sense to understand, not make moral judgments on your kids prematurely so that you're picking the good kid and the bad kid and doing all of those kind of things. So those 30% of families that are not doing those things, that's not abuse and neglect. We're not talking about a mass removal of children or anything like that. But those kids are doing less well, even after you take into account parental education and neighborhood and access to childcare and all the rest of it. So you can see quite clearly that there are some differences there. And quite often what that's about is about people parenting the way that they understood they ought to parent based on what their parents did, et cetera, which is what people quite often fall back on. And so when you start looking at what it is Canadian parents think, you start to discover where some of these things come from. So for instance, it turns out that about 30% of Canadian parents believe that children as young as 6 weeks to 2 months of age, if they're crying a lot, are consciously trying to manipulate
Oh,
you.
you hear that all the time.
So motive is being ascribed in a way that makes no sense. So it's an overestimation of the level of agency there.
Well,
right?
We'll just stop there for a second.
Yeah.
What do you say to that person who says that's a look at this baby already is figuring out how to pull my strings. Look at this child is manipulating me. I hear that all the time.
Yes.
And?
Yes. And what do you say to them?
Now, I don't mean literally,
Yeah.
I'm not asking you to do parenting advice,
No,
but
I
what
know.
does your
Thank you.
research tell you about whether or not you're saying that's not reasonable? Why is that not a reasonable assumption?
Well, could what I'd like to say to that is...
You say what you'd like to say. Because I'm not authoritarian,
You're flexible, you're imposing the rules
Flexible.
flexibly,
Right.
that's right, yeah. There's a question of teachable moments. I mean, one of the things that we do understand is that Canadian parents have an incredibly heightened sense of personal responsibility, right? And so that when you lay messages on busy, economically strapped parents who are running back and forth, what tends to happen is you create more and more self-doubt, right? Most parents are monitoring themselves, wondering, am I doing the right thing?
Yeah.
If I'm at work, should I be at home? If I'm at home, should I be at work? Blah, 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 all of that, right? Like it's a no-win situation. So it isn't clear to me that the teachable moment is necessarily when the reactive thing has
Right.
already started to happen. And you know, it's funny because a number of years ago, I was visited by somebody from Swedish Research Board. And Sweden at the time had this board where they were basically looking for the research questions of the future. And the person came to me and said, you know, in terms of public investment in the early years, we've gone about as far as we can go. We're spending 1.5% of our GDP in the early years. We've got income programs, we've got universal access to quality childcare, we've got developmental monitoring monthly for the first year and a half of life. We pick up all the vision, hearing, dental, speech, and language things before kids reach school, but we've still got some problems, right? And we think the problems are coming from the fact that some people bring children into the world in relationships that can't handle them. That it's about learning about relationships and learning about relationship formation. And so they were looking for the teachable moments about that, right? Trying to take it back further, you know?
Do you mean the relationship between the people who are going to be raising this child?
Yeah,
You think that happens?
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah. But you know, I mean, it's one of the reasons that I was an enthusiastic supporter of things like Roots of Empathy
Yes.
from early on, because those are real teachable moments.
Yes.
You know, when you bring babies into the classroom when kids are young and they watch the child grow up and they see the way that the child changes over time and all the rest of it, stuff can go in that can, you know.
So you're
can stay.
teaching them to be future parents,
Yes,
to be able
that's
to read the child.
Exactly.
So some parents aren't actually like their parents. Some parents do it differently. And I've
Yes.
always been curious about why do some do it differently? Are there interventions? Like what do you see in terms of helping parents that works?
Yeah.
In terms of helping parents do what that child needs?
Well, first off, it is true, for instance, that most parents who were abused as children do not abuse their children. On the other hand, the proportion of parents who are abused as children who do abuse their children is higher than the proportion of, you see what I'm saying, right? So they're more likely to, but mostly they won't. Right?
Okay.
So that's
Yes.
positive.
I'm-
You got that? Yeah. Okay. I think I'm about to fall off this chair.
I know. Thank
Yeah.
you, Dennis, for these chairs,
Yeah.
by the way.
On the other hand, in terms of that part of the equation, there is good evidence now that shows that programs like the Nurse-Family Partnership, which is being trialed in BC now, where you try to identify parent-child combinations that are likely at risk early on, and you intervene in parenting right from the start, right from the time that they go home from the hospital through nurse home visiting, building up trust relationships and working on parenting skills before a pattern of maltreatment has been established, that you can get effective change with that. The evidence, though, suggests that if you wait and react until after maltreatment's occurring, you're not going to make much progress there. So the evidence is pretty consistent on that part. Right?
So interesting you said parent-child combinations. So you didn't say bad parents.
No.
So describe what you mean by that.
Well, you know, it's a little bit like, you know, Anna Karenina, the beginning of Anna Karenina, they talk about, you know, happy families are all happy in the same way, unhappy families are all unhappy in different ways. And if you're an epidemiologist like me, you think, oh, right, that's the multiple risk factor model, right?
Of course you do.
Of course you do.
Of course
What
you
else would you
do.
think about, right? So, you know, you can imagine, like, there's 8 things you need to be happy, and so happy people have all those 8 things. But if you only have 7 of them, then you're not. And there's 7 different ways that can go, or 6 of them, and there's a bunch of ways. You can see what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
So,
Well, here's the thing about Clyde. If you see 50% of what he's saying, you're doing really well. I always say yes.
Yeah,
like,
right.
Yeah. Okay, carry on.
So anyway, you know, like we know, for instance, from the resilience literature, that the children, that 30% or so of children who come from really difficult backgrounds who do well anyway, tend to be ones who have, for instance, very easy temperaments to begin with, right? So you can imagine if you're a parent living in a basement suite, you're pressed, you don't know where your next dime is coming from, you know, you have very little social support. If you have a kid who cries all the time, right, that's going to be a fundamentally different thing than having a placid kid, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, in that sense, that's what we're talking about the dyads, right? It's just like what each draws out of the other. And, you know, it's an interesting question because, you know, one of the things that we work on is the rights of the child. And one of the key elements of the rights of the child is the right to participate in the decisions that affect you, right? And believe it or not, up until 5 years ago, UNICEF's indicator battery around that defined that as a right that was actionable from age 12 to 17.
Wow.
As though a crying baby is not engaging in activities, participating in decision-making around them, right? So a lot of the work that we've been doing actually in terms of creating monitoring protocols for rights of early childhood is to try to get that understanding, right, of all the different forms of communication that are going on earlier than that, right?
And even though the child doesn't have a voice for themselves,
No.
that
They have
somehow
an
they're
input.
recognized as if somebody sees that response, they have a right.
Yes, exactly.
You know, I'm thinking back to that example of the 2-year-olds being most aggressive, and what you're
Yes.
saying about the importance of the environment in the early years, and the importance of the style of parenting in the early years. And you left us dangling with this, all children at that age, or children at that age are probably most aggressive. The idea is how to help them not be, as opposed to how to keep them from becoming that way. How do we help them not be? What kinds of things, what do we know now about those people who are successful in not becoming aggressive compared to those kids who become the abusers?
Well, the fact is that in that window of opportunity, let's say age 2 to 5, the common sense things work. The timeouts work, the getting down at eye level and talking to the child, getting the child to have to go back and deal with the kid that they've knocked over who's lying on the ground, et cetera, the encouraging the use of the words. All of those things work. You know, so at that point, it's basically doing the kind of engaged things that well-meaning people would do. You know, what doesn't work is hitting the child for hitting the kid. What doesn't work is, you know, it's good that, you know, child A hit child B, it'll toughen them up. It's a rough world out there, you know, or all of those kind of things aren't the right way.
And really, you're talking about educating the heart.
Yes.
And people tend to think about educating the heart as beginning in kindergarten, that it's about being in a classroom and taking a program in the classroom where you educate the heart.
Yeah.
I think your key message here is that educating the heart starts at the very beginning. All of those things you're talking about will be foundational to when the child enters kindergarten.
Yeah. In effect, I know it's pointy-headed, but it's like educating the synapse is what we're talking about. Yeah, right.
It's fairly pointy-headed.
Yes, that's very pointy-headed.
But it is important because of the research that you've told us about earlier, that we really can't avoid that kind of thinking now because we understand so much more about this idea of biological embedding.
Yes.
And I think that those images you showed are a bit complicated for most of us. And so I'm going to ask you to stay with us for a while and explain more to us. First of all, you kind of had a hunch about biological embedding before science was able to prove that it was happening.
Yes.
So tell us that story as a narrative. What were you seeing? What were you thinking?
Okay, so it is fair to say that, you know, I came up with the idea of biological
That's
embedding.
his term.
Yeah. Back in the mid-90s, so it's been 14, 15 years ago that I came up with it. And I came up with it actually looking at something different, which was trying to understand this thing that I was talking about before, this gradient in health. So what we see is, even in wealthy countries like Canada, where, you know, on average there is enough for everybody, you see as you go from the bottom to the top of the socioeconomic ladder, be it defined by income, education, or occupation, you see that gradually health status goes up as you go from the bottom to the top of the ladder. And not only is that true, but that when you ask what are the causes of death, let's say, that make the difference in life expectancy across the range, it cuts across most causes of death. Moreover, if you go back 100 years ago and you say, what were causing health inequalities back 100 years ago? It was infectious diseases, and then heart disease came along, and the heart disease did it, and then AIDS come along, and AIDS did it. So we see the gradient, this gradient replicating itself on new conditions as they come into society, right? And then finally what we discovered was that the gradient begins life as a gradient in developmental health, as I was showing you here. And so
you mean that it starts really early?
It starts
really
really
early. These
early.
things that go wrong or right, science starts to show you that those things, and that's because you had longitudinal studies
Yes,
that over
that-
time. You looked
yeah,
at a
that
kid
start at
then, you
birth
looked at
and
them
go-
at
yes.
30, okay.
That's right. So we have studies that follow people from birth through a decade,
Yeah.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 decades throughout life, and that's what you see. You see that the pattern is that one way or another, early on in life, different social experiences are leading to different developmental states, and those developmental states predict careers of health, well-being, and learning and behavior across the balance of the life course. And so that's where the idea of biological embedding came from, right? But it's only been within the last 5 years or so that we've actually got the mechanisms now that show it, right? And so
Yeah, because it almost seems like a duh. I mean, doesn't it make sense that what happens to you early in life would affect, wouldn't you think that that just is common sense, that what happens to you early in life? I guess it hasn't always been common sense. What happens to you early in life will affect you when you're 30 or 40 years old.
no, it hasn't been common sense. I mean, you know, for instance, I mean, part of the reason that I raised this question over, you know, the bullying things, right, is because there's an example where we don't look at that.
I see
you
what
know,
you're saying.
another example, you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Aboriginals. It's defined as being about those people who were in residential school. What about their children? What about their grandchildren? You know, you pull a generation or two or three out of the parenting cycle and you desocialize them for that, it's not going to disappear immediately afterwards. We know that. And yet, policy after policy, if you look any month in the newspaper and you look at the policy and ask, have people used what we understand about the life course to define this policy? You will find 9 times out of 10 they haven't. So what is common sense is not policy sense in our country.
What do we know? Maybe give us some examples of some studies that have gone from the early years later into life. What do we know are some of the things now, for sure we know, were affected by those early years? What kinds of outcomes?
Well, you know, by the end of the second decade of life, you can see a contribution from the first 5 years later on school failure, early criminality, unwanted pregnancy. By the third and fourth decades of life, you can see influences on blood pressure, obesity, mental health problems. You know, by the fifth and sixth decades of life, you can see influences on heart disease, diabetes, and other chronic diseases. And then later on in life, you can see influences on the rate of cognitive aging and the rate at which various organ systems decline. Right? So you can see that right across. So I'm not saying that the things that happen after age 5 don't matter. What I'm saying is that the things that have happened from 0 to 5 have an independent effect on those things, over and above what comes later on.
So before we talk more about that, just stay with this for a minute, because when I hear that, I think, yikes, if I did something or something happened to me as a child or my child before age 5, it's irreversible. Is that true? Are there things that are irreversible? You mentioned the sight one. Maybe explain more about that. And are there some things, though, that you can recover later?
Yeah, no, I mean, there are lots of things that you can recover. And this is a difficult dance because, on the one hand, there are some things that seem to land and stick and not go away. So when you look at, for instance, what's happened with, you know, the Romanian orphans. Romanian orphans are a fairly well-known group because they were badly neglected in the orphanages, and they still are, right? And there, what's basically happened is that if they were in the orphanages for more than about 20 months, 0 to 20 months of age, and they get adopted out, fundamentally, forget it. They might have a slight IQ gain. They might do a bit better socially and emotionally, et cetera, but most of the gains that one sees before teenage disappear at teenage, right? So basically, it's a mess, right? It's a mess. And it's a very hard story to talk about because a lot of people around the world have adopted those kids, right? And you don't have a lot of real success stories. And what's even worse is some of the early success stories, including ones in British Columbia, stop being success stories when they hit teenage, right?
What do you mean stop being? What does that look like?
It means that the kid who seemed fine, as soon as the, you know, sex hormones start to rage and all the rest of it, starts
Or high
burning
school.
down the barn and and all the rest of it. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
So there are certain things that are irreversible, and yet what do we know about, that we talk about the plasticity of the brain,
Yes.
which means the brain continues to, and you said that part of your brain that is responsible for making decisions continues to develop well into, I think I heard you say, your third decade.
Yes, yes.
So you mean you're still That's an interesting
Yes.
comment.
Well, we all know too that we can be lifelong learners. Like there's all sorts of things that do mold and change. The question is really about these foundational things, right? So, you know, there you are. You're somebody who's grown up in a way that you're one of those people, let's say, for whom ambiguous-looking faces are threatening. Right? And we can see that. We see that at the extremes. We even see that across the socioeconomic distribution, that as you go from the top to the bottom of the socioeconomic distribution, on average, the fraction of children who see threat in ambiguous-looking faces goes up. Okay? That's there, right? Now, you build on top of that, and you get wisdom, and you come to know intellectually that these people who are staring at you, like most of you are right now, are not really about to eat you all up. Nonetheless, you have that particular energy, right? That comes out first, and you have to work and overcome it, right? So one of the issues has always been that if you try to retrofit things that are missed developmentally early, sometimes you can get there, but you have to put huge amounts of energy into it, and then you're sacrificing other things. So you get into these kind of things that, you know, you get into with the politics of the foundation skills assessment. You know, there's some school which is bound to do not well on that because 60% of the kids went into school vulnerable, and yet the school is going to be penalized as though they're responsible for that. And they try to get the kids to do that by teaching to the tests. They're going to end up pushing aside all the other activities, whereas in other schools where only 15% of the kids are vulnerable, they're not going to have to push aside all the other activities. So you end up potentially getting into zero-sum games with that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. I can hear people are probably wanting to start to ask questions, but I want to go back for a minute to these biological determinants, because to me that's very threatening. You know, if I thought that I made mistakes as a parent, but that it was possible to reverse them somehow entirely, I'd feel a lot better. It's very scary to think that things that I'm doing to and with my child so early on is actually changing my genes and changing my nervous system and changing my brain. That's scary. So I need you to tell me a little bit more about that. What is it? Well, first of all, let's start with the nervous system, it's the stress response, as you call it. And remembering that all of this is about educating the heart, because it's about what do we need to know to help our children have the foundations to operate in the world socially and emotionally, right?
Yes, yes.
So what do we need to know about what happens to a child's brain depending on how they're treated when they're young in terms of their stress response, and what's the implications of that?
Okay. Well, we know a number of things. We know, for instance, that children who are subjected to out-and-out maltreatment, right? What happens is that early on, one of the key stress response pathways, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, tends to be hyperactive, right? So it in a sense adapts to the threats that the kids feel by becoming hyperactive. And then what it tends to do is it starts to burn out. And it burns out at a much quicker rate than the rest of ours do. So what ends up happening is that you start off early on being very reactive, but then as time goes on, the capacity to mount vital energy in response to legitimate challenges, like having to write a test, to having to do whatever, starts to wear out, right? And you can't mount the energy response that you need in terms of that kind of thing. So we know that that happens at the extreme end, right?
So what does that look like in a child? This is the child who what?
Well, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can see it by looking at the child, right? You know, that's part of the reason why some of these biological parameters have some interest. But, you know, for instance, like in one of the studies that I work on in Britain, the 58 British birth cohort, you know, you can see that the incapacity to mount that stress response by the time kids were in high school was a very strong determinant of their, for instance, their capacity to pass math exams, right? And so you could see this huge difference in that.
Because if you don't have that stress response and you don't get raised up for the math
you can't focus.
Okay, so you need a little bit of that.
You need a bit of that, right?
Anxiety too.
So what it is, it's a feast or famine thing.
Okay,
Is that,
got
you
it.
know, the system is hyperreactive and then it burns out,
Yeah,
right? That kind of thing goes on.
You overwork the system early on, I get it.
you overwork the system. You know, it's interesting what you say. Going back to what you say, this idea that, you know, once people start talking about biology, it gets scary, right? Yeah, I see that. But why is it then? This is what I find scary. I find scary that Canada is the OECD country, wealthy country, that spends the least in the early years as a proportion of our gross domestic product.
Of all the OECD countries?
Yes. We spend 0.3% of our GDP on investing in the early years and supporting families in the early years. You know, countries like Sweden and the Nordic countries spend 1.25, 1.5, 1.75%.
You should talk to them.
I do talk to And now, what's even scarier, right, is places like Colombia and Thailand that are middle-income countries have now made it national priority. Early child development is a national priority. Everybody reports to the president about that. And here in Canada, we produce all these frameworks of understanding. We produce some of the best science in the world. And it's all very fine until anybody starts talking about let's spend some money. And then we don't want to. We don't want to. And what we want to do is we want to wave our fingers at parents and say, you do it. Okay. The fact is, these issues require collective response, right? It's too much to say to parents, you're responsible for every neuron inside your kid's brain. You know? And yet that's the game we play, right? And the way the game is going to be played is, you know, that the top 1% or so will buy themselves out and everybody else will struggle, right? That's, you know, that's the way, that's what I find scary.
Okay, so yeah, ultimately it comes down in those early years to a parent and a child because the child isn't out there in society. So you're saying the parents need support so that they can provide the child the kind of security that the child needs.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible to create a policy mix that would provide the maximum opportunities for families to do the best by their children, you know, and it has been done in you know, for instance, in the Nordic countries. And, you know, I think that's the kind of thing that we've got to be saying is that, you know, like we don't expect families to educate their children by themselves. You know, we could. If we were to apply the same rule to there, we could say, you know what, it's really important for people to be literate and numerate and to learn computers. Do it yourself. You know, I mean, you saw the way those curves went in terms of the sensitive periods in brain development. You know, when Sven Brandberg comes over from Sweden, he shows you that their investments follow that, right? When there's the most brain development, there's the most investment, right? In Canada, it goes the opposite way. Right? Less brain development, more investment.
So actually that's, you know, for parents, you're right. I think that there is a lot of feeling of this is all, that's why I responded that way. This is totally our responsibility, right? Yeah. And I think what you're saying is that you can't do it alone. That does take a village, essentially.
Yes. Which is a very important point, you know, this idea of it takes a village to raise a child. This is another one that people, you know, fill up in the rubber chicken circuit with saying that. But the fact is, that the English-speaking countries do not believe that, right?
What do you mean?
Our foundation is the Elizabethan Poor Laws of 1608, and they said it does not take a village to raise a child. That you have children, you are responsible for them, and if you screw it up, we will step in, and we will step in punitively, and we will punish you, and we will punish the child, right? 1608, and then everybody jumped on the Mayflower and sailed off, right? And brought that basic spirit to Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand. And that was the model, right? And the poor laws of the 19th century were built on that. And the fact that 11% of the Canadian population are the descendants of workhouse children is testament to that. And they were sent over to Canada to basically be agricultural slave labor right through until 1927, right? That was, it doesn't take a village to raise a child. And then when the OECD started tracking expenditures on the early years in the late 1990s and put all of the wealthy countries together, all 6 of the English-speaking countries were at the bottom. And all the other countries were, the more communitarian countries were above that. So the fact is that we have a 400-year history of this. And in fact, you can see it anytime anybody talks about public investment, they'll immediately, you know, you got people, the state's taking over, the state wants to raise our child, you know, you get these idiotic kind of responses that come up, right? And Yeah.
Yeah, I can see this part of your brain's really lighting up because
Yes,
this
no,
makes
that's true. That's right.
rightfully so. I mean, the thing is that you have been looking at this your whole career.
Yes, yes.
And you understand more and more as research comes out about the importance of those years. So I can see why you feel so emotional about this.
Yeah. And I also partly feel it because I don't want to be involved with malpractice, right? Like, it is a form of malpractice to go out and scare parents all the time, right? And I know, absent of collective solutions, that's what happens. We've done polling. We know.
Yeah.
We know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So speaking of scaring parents, let's just talk for a little bit more about this idea of biological embedding. I think, and people also call it epigenetics, right? Is that right? A similar thing?
Epigenetics is a mechanism of biological
Okay.
embedding.
So that idea of biological embedding, that the behavior that a parent, what's happened?
I didn't know there was a nut in my chair.
As in a,
Never mind.
it's gone now. So the idea is that this idea that we actually change our genetic something, that we change our genes. I'll say it simply. I know you're going to correct me,
Yeah,
but
I will correct
that we
you, yeah.
change our genes. So we used to think that we just changed our behavior. It was just a behaviorism, right? You do A and B happens, and then you do B and it goes back to being A again. But you're saying it changed your genes. So just explain that a little bit more to me in plain English.
Okay. Well, okay, so when people think about changing the genes, what they think about is like being zapped by rays of some sort or another. And it goes in and it mutates something, right?
Yes.
Now, mutation would mean actually going in and changing the basic 4-letter alphabet of the DNA. So the DNA has a 4-letter alphabet. We're not talking about that. What we're talking about is that there are ways to influence the way in which the genes function without actually changing the genes themselves. So that little drawing I had up there with the guy and the little CH3 that came out of the guys, right? That's a little carbon and 3 hydrogen groups that can sit on top of one of the 4 building blocks, the C, the cytosine, and forms methylcytosine. And when it does that in a promoter region of the DNA, that turns that promoter dimmer switch down.
So what's something that a child would do or a capacity they would have that would be affected by that? What's a gene that could be affected that could make a difference in your life?
Okay, well, let me, the best models we have with this are not in humans, but they're in animals,
Yeah.
okay? So for instance, by far and away the best paradigm for this is the licking, suckling paradigm in relation to the rats, right? So it turns out, in baby rats, between day 9 and 16 of their life, you have a sensitive period in the development of that hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis inside your body that's got to do with secretion of cortisol, etc.
Which has to do with emotions
And stress.
and heart. And
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So some baby rats get a lot of licking and suckling from their rat mummies and others don't, right? And those who get a lot of licking and suckling end up with a very calm HPA axis, and those that don't get much licking and suckling get a very hyperactive HPA axis, right? And those with the calm axis, throughout their lives, their capacity to learn and problem solve remains pretty high, whereas those who have the hyperactive, what happens is all of that cortisol that's circulating gradually damages cells in the learning and memory parts of their brain. So as they go through 1 year, 2 years, 3 years of life, which is old for a rat, their capacity to learn drops. So if you then turn around and you take the pups from the rat mummy who licks and suckles a lot, and you give them to the low lick and suckler and vice versa. That's called cross-fostering. To remove the genetic effect,
Yes.
what happens? What happens is that the high licker and suckler licks and suckles these rat pups that are not hers and the others don't. These guys end up getting the good pattern and these guys get the bad pattern. So it goes according to the licking and suckling. So that was established about 10 years ago. And then, because of what you can do with rats, they were able to actually show that the licking and suckling sets about a biochemical cascade that goes right down to certain key genes. And through epigenetic mechanisms of the sort we're talking about here, it will down-regulate certain parts of the HPA axis and upregulate other parts so you get this nice calm pattern, or vice versa over here. So they've actually worked out the entire biochemical cascade, right? So that meant to people, well, let's find the licking and suckling analogs in humans, right?
Yes.
And that's what we're trying to do, but it's very slow. For one, you can't dig into people's brains. You know, you have to use blood cells and things like that. But we've done some work. You know, we've, for instance, whoa. Yes, sirree. I don't think this microphone was licked and suckled enough when it was young. Anyway,
You've done some research
Yeah, we've
to
done some
see
research.
what the rats
Yeah.
have to do with human beings.
yeah, and so for instance, in one study we've been working on, it's a group from Wisconsin where in fact they collected really, really good data every 3 months from the second trimester of pregnancy, birth, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months of age through to 18 months, and every 6 months thereafter on what was going on in the family. So we have all this information about family functioning and family stress, et cetera, et cetera. And then when the kids were teenagers a few years ago, we were able to get buccal samples on there, right?
From the inside of
Yeah,
it.
and we were able to look at the DNA in the buccal samples and look for these epigenetic marks. So what we're looking for is a pattern, what we call an epigenetic signature. And lo and behold, what we found was that there was a very large epigenetic signature for mother's stress in the first 18 months of the children's lives. In other
Yikes.
words, way back 15 years earlier on, if the mother had been talking about financial stress and parental conflict, et cetera, a lot at that time, 139 different gene promoter regions were methylated differently between the high stress and the low stress, right?
Yikes.
Then, after 18 months, disappears, right? So whatever the mother said from 18 months onward didn't matter, but 0 to 18 months
Okay,
it
so
mattered.
let me just-
And then the father started to matter
Oh, okay.
in the
Oh,
in the preschool period. Not as much, you know, a dozen genes or so, but the father started to matter, right? So you get these very specific patterns of when mother's experience seems to be landing and sticking versus when fathers did, right? Now this is early days, and of course we're using buccal samples. We're not inside the brain. We have to do more studies, and the methods we're using only get at some of the promoters and not at other promoters, blah, blah, blah. So there's 20 years of work to be done here. But we're starting to see these patterns,
Yeah.
right? And they're starting to make sense.
So what? So what?
So what we was talking about before, so what?
So
You
it
know?
really gets deeply embedded is what you're saying. That
Yes.
really emphasizes how
Yes,
important those
yes,
early
because the
years are.
thing is that the point is if you can pick up the methylation patterns 15 years later, or in our other study on the British birth cohort, we can pick it up at age 45. You can pick up early socioeconomic status and early abuse ages 0 to 7. You can see it in the white blood cells at age 45. You know, that's sticking.
That's sticky.
That's sticky.
Just so people understand, when you say the 58 British cohort study, these are a group of people who've been followed. They were born in 1958, and they've been followed regularly their whole life
Yes, yes.
to
yes,
look
that's
at
right.
all of these aspects of their development over life, and then you
Yes.
can relate what happened.
Yes, that's right.
amazing.
Yeah, and you can statistically partial out later
You weren't even
experiences,
born
don't
in 1958.
Sure I was. Whoa.
You're part of the study. One of the
Well, actually, for those of you who have ever seen the movies, you know, 7 Up, 28
Yeah,
Up and
that's
stuff,
it, yeah.
those guys are concurrent with that, right? So
Oh.
that's 13 kids who are concurrent with.
I did
the
not
Brit-
know
yes,
that.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes. So you
Huh.
can see. And you know, it's interesting because Britain has a 1946 cohort, a 58 cohort, a 1970 cohort, a millennium cohort, and a new one that they're doing. And they have a whole series of them, and they compare back and forth across them, right? So that they are working always on trying to understand how the life course is unfolding. And you can do everything from, you know, the kind of health things to looking at, you know, women's labor market experience and things like that between those things. And I only wish.
So far we've been talking about how the environment around the child will affect the child's early years, which will affect their life. And we've looked at some of the specifics around that, especially in terms of heart-mind development. What we haven't really talked about is what the child brings to the equation, except that earlier on I asked you to talk a bit about that. But there is a fellow at UBC named Tom Boyce who's looking at the fact that each child comes into this equation with a different makeup.
Yeah.
And so they will respond differently to adverse situations, for example, or to positive situations. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So Tom Boyce is internationally famous for the idea of children being differently biologically sensitive to context, is what he talks about. So he talks about some kids, which he calls dandelion children, who in a sense you can plant them and they can grow anywhere, right? And they seem to do equally well no matter what.
Yeah.
And then other kids he calls orchids, right? In the sense that in certain environments, they do really, really badly, and in other environments, they do really, really well. And it's a very important concept, partly because it's true. And so when you ask, what would make some neighborhoods in BC higher vulnerability neighborhoods than others, it's probably got to do largely with the huge swings in the orchid subfraction of the population, right, on the one hand. The other thing, though, that's even more important is that many of you will have heard about the notion that, there's a gene for depression or a gene for aggression or something like that. Well, Tom's work blows that out of the water in the sense that what there is genes that are more sensitive to context with respect to depression or aggression. In other words, when you look at these things, and we know which genes they are, and all the rest of it. For instance, we'll talk about the ones that related to depression. That if you have certain gene combinations and you grow up in a crummy environment, your chances of being depressed are way, way higher than the other kids. But if you have that same combination of genes and you grow up in a really good in an early nurturant context, your chances of being depressed are lower than the other kids, right? So you have one group, if you can imagine that, this is the lousy environment, this is the good environment, this is their risk of being depressed, and it kind of goes like that. And another group that it goes like that, right? So the biologically sensitive to context, the not biologically sensitive to context, the dandelions and the orchids, right? And we're finding we now have about a dozen examples of this, where you can go right down to that gene-environment interaction level, and you can say, yes, there are orchid-like mechanisms and dandelion mechanisms. Yeah.
The thing I love about that research is that in our culture, if a child is sensitive, it's, I'm going to make a broad statement here. They're called things like shy, or it's not really an admired characteristic,
yes.
by and large. If a child is very sensitive, they're shy. That's my quiet one. That's my. When I talked to Tom Boyce and discovered this, and I could say to those parents, that child who's the sensitive child, who's maybe the orchid child, if they're given a really rich environment, they will surpass the dandelion child. That's what you're saying.
Yes.
Because the point is that they'll absorb what's in the environment better than another child.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right.
So the implications of this research are that we maybe see the potential in those children who are shy, instead of seeing them as, well, that's just the shy child, right?
That is right. That is right. A, that's right. B, it also goes to the question of what it means to provide quality childcare or quality school environments. So part of what Tom's work is about the emergence of hierarchies in those kind of contexts, and showing that if you just sort of leave the kids alone, or if you aren't very good at managing situations, then predictable things will start to happen, right? And the kids who are the more sensitive to context will have a tendency to end up at the bottom of the barrel, and they could get victimized, et cetera, et cetera. But really good childcare workers, really good primary school teachers and kindergarten teachers spot those things, know how to deal with those things, reduce that. And you actually can, in a sense, create egalitarianism in a childcare context or a kindergarten classroom, et cetera, based on those qualities, right? And those are qualities that you can learn and know and transmit.
What do you mean, like what?
Well, the sensitivity of the teacher to understanding that, right? Like, so, to understanding that, well, yeah. We used to say, when there's been a lot of animal work in relation to this, so you see exactly the same things in rhesus monkeys, right? And it turns out there that you can get what you call the neurotic to chartered accountant transformation, right? So that under one circumstance, the nervous, shy child ends up at the bottom of the heap, under other nurturant circumstances, though, that turns into a form of vigilance on behalf of the troop, right? So that's what I mean by the neurotic to chartered accountant transformation, right? So it's a question of being able to identify the characteristics and draw the orchid out, in effect, right? And, you know, some people do it naturally, others don't. But the ways in which people do it naturally can be transferred to a great degree. And that's what it means to talk about quality childcare, for instance.
And that's significant for parents as well.
Absolutely.
To recognize.
Yeah.
What's Tom finding out about hierarchy? I mean, there are hierarchies in kindergarten?
Yeah. Yeah.
Preschool?
Yes. Yeah. No, there sure are. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
What does that look like? What does that mean?
Well, what it means is, I mean, he has these movies, and they're great, you know, where, you know, there'll be some kid, you know, who's very decisive, and, you know, she will decide, you know, she's going to go off and play fireman, right? And off she goes, right? And the, you know, other kid who's playing with her before, whatever she was doing, watches her go off and does it, and then follows along and does it. So you can see the leader's followers developing right off the bat. The other kind of thing, though, you can see is if you provide kids with these toys, like, you know, where there's a movie that you can see, but 2 kids have to turn cranks in order to see the movie, and you put 4 kids in front of that, right? So 1 kid gets to see the movie, 2 kids get to turn the crank, and the 4th kid gets left out. And then you just watch, you know, which kids get to watch the movie the most, which kids end up turning the crank, and which kids, yeah, of course, they decide, right? And it turns out that predictable hierarchies will emerge, right? And there will be boy-type hierarchies and there will be girl-type hierarchies, but they both emerge. And it's interesting, because in the boys' cases, the boys who get to watch the movie the most are the most popular boys. In the girls' cases, the girl who gets to watch the movie the most is not the most popular girl.
Oh, wow. Why? Why is that? What is that about?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
What are the children basing that on? What are they detecting that they know that one's popular or not popular when they're so little? What is it?
More empathy for the girl who's quieter.
They have more empathy for the girl who's.
To watch it because it's a privilege.
Ha.
Something that could be.
That's my guess.
It could be right. It could be right. I mean, I'm not sure I can give you a better answer. I mean, it's wonderful to watch these movies and see these things emerge, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, hierarchies emerge in all primate species, but some are steeper than others, some are enforced by violence or not, right? And what Tom's been able to show is that in the, you know, the better of these group situations, the steepness of the hierarchies are reduced, right? And I mean, that has a huge meaning for, you know, notions of social and emotional learning.
And probably over time, not just for that kindergarten class, but for the rest of school for sure.
You would think so, yes.
All right.